Good morning, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us this morning. I'm very, very excited. I'm Dora Muhammad, Congregation Engagement Director and Health Equity Program Manager at Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy. Today is the first part of our three-part series called JAB Talks, which is a part of our JAB initiative, which focuses on three primary principles of ethics in healthcare: justice, autonomy, and beneficence. The JAB, the JAB. We developed this initiative to create a vital injection in public discourse during and beyond the COVID pandemic. I believe that a basic understanding and language of these ethics will be one way, a powerful way, a transformative way to help heal wounds of the historic harm towards communities of color by the medical field and dispel misinformation, which prevails as two harsh barriers to care for Black and Brown people. Today, we are talking about justice. Justice has been defined as the constant and perpetual will to allot to every man his due. The most common framework of this definition is the judicial system. Courts, lawyers, judges, juries, trials that hold wrongdoers accountable and mete out punishment and determine compensation for harm. But within the healthcare setting, it's a different framework. Justice is the principle of equity with two main elements: the equal worth of all persons and the fair opportunity of resources. Martin Luther King Jr. said that of all the forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhuman. Joining me this morning to present an antidote to medical injustice through this conversation are three amazing leaders. You will first hear from Ms. Lillie Head, President of the Voices for Our Father's Legacy Foundation. She is the daughter of one of the human subjects of the U.S. Public Health Service's study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male at Tuskegee. Then I'll be talking with Ms. Ysabel Duron, founder and president of the Latino Cancer Institute. And finally, Dr. Jehan Gigi El-Bayoumi, professor of medicine and founding director of the Rodham Institute at George Washington University. So happy to have them with me.
Thank you.
Yes, these women exemplify a holistic paradigm shift required to sustain equitable healthcare delivery, which is our theme for our talk today. Now, I'm going to begin with a quick video of the Tuskegee Legacy Story series, and then you'll hear from Ms. Head.
Let's start over. There we go.
I had someone tell me that they were concerned about getting the COVID vaccine because of the syphilis study. They didn't even know my grandfather was a part of the study.
Tuskegee is a very sacred place. There is no way you cannot feel history.
Think about the Tuskegee Airmen and all of the greatness that they did, and then to find out that in this same space, such an atrocious study was being heaped upon our men.
The study began in 1932. Segregation and Jim Crow were the structures of how our society functioned. What happened with the men and their families? It was the untreating of syphilis.
The original title of the study is Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male.
They were not treated for the disease that killed them, that made them blind.
My great-great-grandfather, John Good, he was of the clergy, he was a farmer. He was a syphilitic in the study, and our family really didn't talk about it.
Both of my great-grandfathers had been a part of that study. They were sharecroppers, and then later they were able to get land of their own.
On my right here is Alec, where we call him Big Daddy. On my left here is Papa Frank Cooper, and he went blind at a young age.
I am the daughter of one of the men in the study, Freddie Lee Tyson. I'm also the daughter of Johnny Mae Neal Tyson. I have to include my wonderful mother because the two of them was on the journey together.
My uncle used to always run after us. We'll get your ear, I'm gonna get, and we just run and run and run, and then we run right back to him.
My grandfather and I were phenomenally close. He worked as a firefighter where the Tuskegee Airmen trained. Actually caught my first fish with my grandfather.
My father had congenital syphilis from his mother.
There were a number of opportunities for the men to receive treatment, and they were very intentionally barred.
And everyone involved in that study wanted it to go untreated until their death. Their body would then be sent to be autopsied to see the effect.
Around 1947, penicillin became widely accepted and widely used. The doctors of the study prevented the men in the study from getting penicillin.
The first thing those doctors should have done for these gentlemen was to make sure that each and every one was treated.
It was the fall of '72. My brother Wallace read an article about the study. A couple of days later, my father received a phone call indicating that he was in the study.
When he found out what the study was really all about and that he had been used and treated as a guinea pig, there was just a lot of shame. I'm so sorry.
In comparing what's happening today with COVID with what happened back in '32, I see more of a contrast than a similarity.
A lot of misinformation is out there that is causing people to think twice or to hesitate. And one of them is the fact they think the men were injected with syphilis, and they were not.
And they were not injected with the spirochete that causes syphilis.
They were not being treated. That is very different from what's happening with COVID-19. The vaccine is being made available to anyone who wants it.
Too many people are using the study as a way of causing their own selves to deny access to vaccines that would save their lives.
And when we talk about COVID-19, for example, we're not talking about the non-treating of Blacks. We're talking about the treating of all people.
The ways in which COVID-19 ravaged Black communities showed that we have underlying vulnerabilities when something like a pandemic hits.
That to me really connects what's happening now with a very important historical legacy. As a result of what happened to these men, it changed the course of American clinical research. It created the institutional review boards, which is a very important intervention that says that there must be people who can examine every study that is done on human beings in this country.
Wherever there's research that's happening, there has to be informed consent documents that are signed, not just when participating in clinical trials, but also if you're going to get any type of a medical procedure. Those things came because of that study.
It boils down to truly understanding the concept of community, which is two words, common unity.
The path from tragedy to triumph travels along the path of learning.
I've taken both of my vaccines, and you're talking about something that happened to my family.
We can't do this by ourselves. In order for us to be healthy together, we need to all be vaccinated.
Good morning. It's so good to be with you, ladies, this morning. It is an honor to be here on behalf of Voices for Our Fathers Legacy Foundation and in the memories of the 623 African-American men unethically and unjustly treated by the United States Public Health Service syphilis study at Tuskegee and Macon County, Alabama, for 40 years. From 1932 to 1972. The video short documentary that you have just viewed is one of many public service promotions that descendants have participated in over the last 18 months. The foundation's purpose is to transform the legacy of the United States Public Health Service study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male at Tuskegee from trauma to shame. By participating in this documentary, as well as several others, the descendants are moving toward a renewed legacy for our ancestors. The mission of Voices for Our Fathers Legacy Foundation is preserving the legacies of the 623 African-American men victimized in the United States Public Health Service syphilis study by fostering social justice, education, and public health research. The foundation was organized in 2014 by descendants as a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Justice had not been afforded our fathers, grandfathers, uncles, cousins, and great-grandfathers. Their humanity had been completely ignored in this study. They were left betrayed only as subhuman, uneducated sharecroppers or poor farmers. Since 1999, descendants had been meeting to commemorate the National Presidential Apology for the study by then President Clinton. In 2011, descendants began sharing their long-lasting feelings of humiliation, anger, pain, shame, and how this study had personally traumatized each of them and our community. We shared our emotions in a safe and understanding environment together. This was the beginning of our healing and forgiveness. By honestly sharing our heartfelt feelings, we became capable of moving to a better place emotionally. In our annual sessions, led by two brilliant ministers and educators, Doctors Edward and Ann Wimberly, for 10 years, we were inspired and gained the courage to seek the justice that our ancestors had been denied. The United States Public Health Service study at Tuskegee and Macon County is the longest biomedical research study in U.S. history. So let me begin by listing some of the unethical and unjust treatment of the study. First, the men were recruited with deception and lies. They were never informed that they were in a study, never told they had syphilis, only that they had bad blood. They were told that they would receive treatment for their bad blood. They never received any medical treatment, only placebo. Their names were placed on a no treatment list for syphilis and circulated nationally within the medical community. They were denied the opportunity to join the military and serve their country. They were never told over 40 years that they had syphilis. They were denied the antibiotic penicillin treatment and used only as lab guinea pigs. There was no lack of accountability for the abusers. And there is much unknown about the research of the biospecimens that they were taken. And then there is numbers that are inaccurate of the men who were in the study. It is the purpose as well as the responsibility of the foundation and all truth seekers to transform the legacy of the Public Health Service syphilis study. We cannot undo the harm that has been done. But as my father, Freddie Lee Tyson, said after learning that he was a victim in this study, he said, "I can't do anything about what has happened to me and all of those men who were in the study. But it's up to you all to see that nothing like this ever happens again." So where do we begin? It's important to begin with the beginning with the rightful name of the study. United States Public Health Service Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male at Tuskegee. It is commonly known and called incorrectly Tuskegee Syphilis Study or Tuskegee Experiment. Henceforth, we should give the study its correct name, United States Public Health Service Syphilis Study at Tuskegee and Macon County, Alabama. By doing this, it shows the ownership, responsibility, and accountability of who that study belongs to. And then we should go about correcting misconceptions and misinformation. One, the men were not injected with syphilis, as so many believe then and even believes now. The men were not treated. Some believe the men were treated. They were not. They were promised treatment, but they did not receive it. And some of the men stopped participating in the study over the course of the study for different reasons. The men were not all sharecroppers. Some owned their own land. The men were ministers and leaders of their rural community. All is not known about the biospecimens and the research data of the study. Next, we remember and respect their humanity. We tell their untold stories. These were humans. They were loved by their families, their communities, and they contributed to the society. Then we must preserve history and honor their legacy by building an appropriate memorial and inspiration garden at the National Center for Bioethics and Research in Healthcare at Tuskegee University. And we encourage and support descendants who are pursuing careers in medicine, healthcare, and medical research by awarding scholarships to undergraduates and postgraduate students. There are some good things that came out of the study. One was mentioned in the documentary. After 1972 and 1979, the development of the Belmont Report came about, and then the establishment of the Office for Institutional Review Boards that monitors biomedical research, protocol, and procedures. And the informed consent, believe it or not, that was in place when all of this happened was strengthened and redirected. All medical procedures now requires understanding of what procedure is being given, but also being given, and the patient must be given must give their consent. Then there was the national apology by the president, William Clinton, in May 16, 1997. Then the apology also supported the building of the National Center for Bioethics and Research in Healthcare at Tuskegee University. And this is the only bioethics center on the campus of an HBCU. And we do annual commemorations every year. We have the descendants have collaborated with several universities and medical students about ethics and equality in medical treatment. We've collaborated with health agencies and community outreach programs. We publish biannual Voices for Our Fathers newsletter since 2011. And we planted shrubs in the dedicated hallowed grounds at Tuskegee University Bioethics Center. In the near future, Memorial, Inspiration, and Reflection Garden. And then we've held the first Macon County Community Day of Healing in 2017. We've engaged in dozens of interviews, both nationally and internationally, to preserve history, educate, and foster social justice. Since 2019, we have all been exceedingly challenged and adapted to life-changing ways of our daily living. We have also witnessed and agonized over the number of African-American deaths caused by COVID-19 virus. Today's trust in medical care within our community is tarnished and eroded, and not because of this study, but the atrocities of medical and social injustice for centuries. Seeing and hearing the number of deaths in the Black and Brown communities climbing every day, and then hearing so many people referring to the study as the reason why they hesitate or will not get vaccinated is very troubling, and was very troubling to the foundation and the descendants. So we could not stand by the wayside silently. We had a responsibility to cry out, plead, do not use the Public Health Service study as the reason. The men were uninformed, and they were denied the vaccines from several uninformed and denied the antibody vaccine, of the antibody penicillin. Today, we can become as informed about different vaccines from several different forms of personal and social outlets. After discerning all that we learned from scientists and talking with doctors and healthcare professionals, we can then make the best decision to protect ourselves and those around us. Vaccination then should be our best choice. The descendants, through the works of the foundation, is transforming the legacy of the United States Public Health Service syphilis study from trauma to shame, from trauma and shame to honor and triumph. There is so much we can do to bring about changes in today's healthcare, and together with others, we can build a bridge to cross from distrust to trust, and that is anchored in trustworthiness. I invite all of our listeners today to visit our website, voicesforfathers.org, to learn more about us, become a member, or donate. I thank you for this opportunity, and special thanks to Ms. Dora Muhammad and the Virginia Interfaith Center for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mrs. Head, for just setting the historic lens. Very, very powerful words in terms of preserving the history and transforming the legacy. Absolutely beautiful. We could not begin this conversation without you setting that historic lens for us. So thank you for your time. And so in response to that now, what we'll have is from the two leaders, from an advocacy lens and a medical practice lens. So first we'll have a conversation with Ysabel Duron, add her, here she is, the president and founder of the Latino Cancer Institute, who's going to talk about the transforming of the healthcare system that Lillie mentioned from her perspective. Very powerful. Ysabel.
Thank you, Dora. Very lovely to be here with all of you this morning, with Jehan and Lillie, of course, as well. Nice to spend this time with you. This is a huge topic. It's one that takes, as Lillie expressed, decades to get one's arm around. We have been in the Latino community working for decades, if not centuries, to right wrongs done to the Latino community over time. And they too suffer from a real lack of expectation of healthcare systems. One of the things, as one of my colleagues in another panel said, the healthcare system is not broken. It's doing what it's supposed to do. It's a business, it's making money. The problem is that it's not there to serve and care for people, and particularly the most vulnerable populations. So I think that that's where we in the advocacy world begin. I think the beauty and the shift and the change since Tuskegee and since many other abuses is that now there are more people like me, like Dr. El-Bayoumi, like Lillie Head, and like others who are in fact advocating and investing time and effort in making change. I have been working around the cancer issue in the Latino community for over 2 decades now. And I recognize that this is not a problem that I can address or that any of us can address from a macro level. We have to do it from community to community to community. We have to educate. We have to ignite our communities so that they take back their right to be cared for. In fact, this to me is what justice is, when the community takes back its rights. And so part of what we attempt to do, because to me, I'm also a journalist of 43 years working in mainstream television, though I no longer work in that industry, I think of communication as the #1 opportunity for people to make things right. There was so much miscommunication around Tuskegee. There was no clear understanding, but it created a myth and a misinformation in the Black community that created a lot of lack of trust. What we discovered with COVID in the Latino community, and particularly in the Spanish language community, is that places like Facebook and Instagram, and particularly in Spanish language communities, were 49% of the information on Facebook to the Latino community was misinformation. There was a great deal of disinformation as well. And the fact of the matter is that with some with language barriers in the first place, trying to get correct information was even more difficult for Spanish-speaking communities. And so it was my belief from the beginning, as COVID started to raise its ugly head, that one needed to talk. One needed to bring the communities together and really address issues of fear, of misinformation, because they would not be ready for the vaccine if they were living with mistrust and with lack of information. So part of a campaign, Dora, that I attempted to launch back a year and a half ago was, don't fight the solution, fight the problem. And so what I attempted to do, and what I did do, was launch a media series, because I wanted to make sure that the press wasn't becoming part of the problem instead of the solution. Despite the fact that I'm so invested in health, I also recognize that there are channels that create access. And one of those is the press. And if the press is miscommunicating, misinforming the community, then it's one of the most important, beyond the doctor, beyond the pastor. The press is one of the most important channels of communication in the Latino community. And so to have misinformation coming through the media simply amplifies and exacerbates the lack of care. Did we just, oh, sorry. Technology being what it is, I thought I disappeared off the big screen, but here I am. So I know it seems like this is off topic, Dora, but to me, when the press itself is not doing the right thing or doing it badly, that also impacts people's health. And I remember in the early days, I had 5 virtual meetings with community health workers across first Northern California, and then I engaged people at my different network agencies around the country and asked them what they were hearing about access to cancer care, access to screening for Latinos during COVID. And what I heard was that COVID had just blocked out the whole issue. people were afraid to go to the hospital for care because they thought they would get COVID. People were hearing things like, if I go get tested, I'll have a chip implanted in me. It'll ruin my DNA. It'll sterilize me. I won't be able to have children, etc. So you have heard all of these.
Yes.
We have all heard these major myths that have evolved. And so our goal was to try to diminish and reduce and take away each one of those one by one by one. And so it wasn't on this macro level. It wasn't about herd immunity. It was about community immunity. Besides which, I don't like that sense of being like a cattle and they're going to herd me into this obedience, right? So community immunity resonates with all of us. We all belong to communities, faith communities, book clubs,
Yes.
right? Our local friendship clubs, and our community of racial and ethnic groups. And so when we're talking about health and healthcare, to me, it is crucial that they connect the dots between community and health, and why they, by keeping the community healthy, that also keeps the community wealthy. So I was constantly trying to connect the dots for the community, because it broke my heart to hear from one of our community health workers who said, what we're hearing from community, who were many essential workers, who had some of the highest rates of infection and mortality in the country, are Latinos, and those are the essential workers. They, one of them said, well, I either go to work and maybe get COVID, or I stay home and my children die of hunger. This was the Faustian bargain. This was the belief that they had no choice. There was no choice. It was either keep my family healthy and my children fed, or it, so it was go to work and do this. And there's no dishonor in work. There was just no safety mechanism between that work and these workers. So they put their faith to some extent in God, that somehow they would be taken care of. And in fact, there was a janitor that was interviewed about COVID and about working. And he said, there's a phrase in Spanish, aguantar. We aguanta, we deal with, we accept, and we do what we can to do what we can. And this is kind of somewhat about resilience.
Resilience. Think about
it, Jehan and Lillie. This is something that our communities have built within. It's a resistance to the problems, and yet it also is part of the problem. It's a double-edged sword, that resistance. So yes. I'm going to tough this out. I'm going to resist. I'm not going to let it get me. But then it gets you.
But it doesn't eliminate the problem. Exactly.
Exactly. So you're not really taking all the necessary steps. And I think our men are the worst. They are the most resistant. They are the hardest to convince, which is why I like to educate the women, because it is the women who bring home the information, the education, and they push those resistant men into doing what is right and good for their well-being. But so to me, health, it has a different lens. It isn't just putting them in a system and having a doc check them and then give them a whole bunch of meds to go take care of. It is really about thinking about their lives holistically and how they make all of it healthy and how the whole family is healthy. And so because cancer is such a major killer in the Latino community, if we can get them to take the steps to intervene early, they can learn a new way of resistance by intervening early. And I think Dr. El-Bayoumi would probably agree that prevention and intervention are the first step we want to introduce into our communities, not when you get to 4th stage colon cancer, then we're
Right.
going to find the latest, greatest drug for you. No, we want to stop it very early on. We want to tell you that you have a predisposition perhaps for colon cancer or colorectal cancer or prostate cancer or breast cancer. We want to raise those signals early and do what we can at the earliest stages in order to diminish risk, first of getting it at all, and second of dying from it. We can prevent a lot of death from cancer. So I look at the approach at the health system as partnering with, not because we all recognize we have to change the system as it currently exists. It does not work for poor people. It does not work for racial and ethnic communities. And so what I have been doing in the 2 decades that I have been working in is to learn to see where the gaps are along this continuum, create educational programs or other ways of intervention, and then partnering with the system that is not working well and helping it be better for the Latino community, particularly
You use the
Spanish
phrase
speaking.
flipping the paradigm. I love it.
Exactly.
In addition to the partnership, what are some of the other things that you are in terms of your approach?
Well, I think for me as a journalist, communication and information are golden. And so speaking about consent, Lillie, without information, without good information, without the right information, and without understanding that information, how can you actually say that that consent is done with full knowledge? I will say I sit on the Institutional Review Board for the All of Us Research Program, which you all might remember was the initiative from President Obama in his last State of the Union in 2015, when he said he wanted to create this 1 million person initiative to lead towards good precision medicine. And my first thought was, oh, I have to get 250,000 Latinos engaged. Little did I know that I would then be invited to sit on the Institutional Review Board. And the very first thing I did in 2016, when I sat down at that table with a lot of well-meaning, well-intentioned, very smart academicians and scientists and ethicists, et cetera, the first thing I said is, we need to have this website in Spanish. Oh, we were going to do it in a year. No, we need to have it now.
Now.
You know, I mean, most of the Latino community in this country is either bilingual or speaks English. But there is that other group that if we're going to consent in, we need to have it in their language and we need them to understand. And so what I did and still sit on the IRB is I want to make sure that when we talk about justice and when we talk about ethics, I'm really asking who's justice and who's ethics? Because even from 1974, when the Belmont report came out and created the idea of justice, beneficence, and autonomy, that was done in that perspective in the 70s. Healthcare, the way we live, how our data is gathered is so different these decades later that we need to revisit that, and we need to revisit that concept of consenting in. And Dr. Dorothy Height, who was the leader of the National Council of Negro Women, sat on that committee in 1974. And she said, the principles are great, but by 2004, at the 25th anniversary of the Belmont report, she was interviewed, and I spent some time looking at her interview, and she said, the principles are still valid, but we need to rethink the guidelines. And I absolutely agree with her.
So here's a shameless plug. So our second talk series, we have one of the speakers will be the chair of the Health Equity Committee at the National Council of Negro Women. And that the second talk focuses on informed consent. So stay tuned, the conversation will continue next month. But go ahead. Nice little plug right there.
Yeah, no, that's fabulous. But because there should be kind of a seamlessness about what we're talking about, because it impacts all along this continuum, so that when you say, what do? I tried it at every table I sit at, from the state level to the national level, you know, from the FDA to the NCI. It is, what is your DEI, since that's become very popular these days, you know, your diversity,
Yes.
equity, and inclusion plan.
Inclusion.
What does it look like? When I sat at that table in 2016, and I wanted to make sure that every single research applicant had a DEI. Show me the footprint where you serve. Who are the populations that are in that footprint? What are the demographic breakdowns? Are you showing proportionate inclusion of those groups in your outreach plan, your education plan? Also, who are your researchers? Have they ever researched before in these communities?
Yes.
Do they have the proper language skills to engage with these communities? Who are your community advisory boards? Do they represent the communities you're trying to reach out to? Do you have the appropriate languages there to help guide you? Do you bring together people with the lived experience that become the connectors for that community? And so it's not just about working within community, it is really about working at every single table and holding people's feet to the fire and making the systems accountable. Mm-hmm. That there is in fact justice, that it is accountable, and that we're going to see, as a result of that, we're going to see relief from it. But Lillie, here's the funny thing, because I keep focusing in on, consent in. I have been talking over and over, how many of us go into the doctor's office and they say, well, you've got to sign the consent in form so that we can treat you. And there's like 3 pages, and you kind of just jump to the bottom and you sign it because you want the doctor to treat you. Of course, you want to give him permission to treat you. Every time I go into the clinics or the offices, I look through those pages and I see there's a box that says, we may engage in research and we might be using your data. But there's no box next to it that says, no, I don't let you use my stuff. It's just one signature at the bottom of the page. And half the time they don't have these things in Spanish. And I go up and I harass the poor person at the desk. But then I also tell the doctor. What were you going to say, Dora?
No, I said that's important. Don't harass them, but it is important to point it out. But I love to be dramatic, so I use the word harass. But no, I think it's beautiful because you set the stage now for the medical response that I'm hoping to have now. Dr. El-Bayoumi bring in. So I want to bring her into the conversation. Okay, so yeah, absolutely. Because again, it's important that as advocates that we know then now, well, what is the response? You know, because sometimes, you know, communication isn't just one-sided. And so I believe that Dr. El-Bayoumi, Gigi, you had just presented such a wonderful paradigm for the medical response in this space through the model. And so I want to give you the floor to talk about what you all do at the Rodham Institute and your vision in transforming what we just talked about and centering community as Ysabel laid out. Thank you for being with us this morning.
Of course. First of all, thank you, Ms. Muhammad. I so appreciate and I'm honored to share, I was going to say the stage, but maybe the Zoom platform with these incredible guests that you have on, Ms. Head and Ms. Ysabel. I'm Gigi El-Bayoumi. I'm a physician. I'm a professor of medicine at GW and also an academic medical educator. The Rodham Institute was something that I founded 8 years ago because I saw 2 things, and the 2 drivers for me to establish it were the following. One, I happen to be of Egyptian heritage. I was born and raised here. I'm not part of the African diaspora. I do come from Africa and I consider myself African. There is no other experience in the history of humanity that begins to match the historical and ongoing, it's not just historical, ongoing abuses of the members of the African diaspora, our brothers and sisters. And one thing that dismayed me being in the capital of Washington, D.C., which I've lived in now 36 years, I come from Michigan, I call myself a born-again Washingtonian. And by the way, when I came to Washington, D.C., it was 87% African-American. That number has decreased to 46%. So I'm mentioning these things, and you will see that they will all relate to health. But the impetus was that here, Washington, D.C., is the capital of arguably the richest and most powerful country in the world. We have a 10-mile span, and if you live in Georgetown, boy, you're lucky. Your average life expectancy is 94 years. But if you live in Anacostia, Ward 8, we've got 8 wards in DC, and Ward 8 being the poorest, your life expectancy is 66.5 years. That is the highest health or life expectancy outcome in the country, almost 27 years. We have the #1 per capita cancer mortality, end-stage kidney disease, and HIV rate. And that's average. So if you look at Ward 8, our HIV rate is the same as Namibia's. Our infant mortality rate is the same as El Salvador and Cambodia. And yet we don't know these things, right? And yet the US government will go and lecture to other countries, other third world countries particularly, to say how third world countries are just not doing a good job, that they're the disparities and the this and the poverty and that. Well, I think that COVID helped to pull the veil and really show that the inequities are just unbelievable in the United States of America. For those of us that are from communities that are underrepresented or under-resourced, whatever they may be, because we talked about Black and Brown people, but I like to also point out that there are minorities within minorities. So think about that disabled family that's living in Anacostia that's African-American. Think of the returning citizen that's Latino trying to re-engage. Think of the undocumented immigrant. But the hypocrisy in my mind was uncovered to a large extent. So I was in a unique position that I take care of a lot of different people, from colleagues and families of my colleagues and staff that I work alongside with, people from all over the city, from all over the country, but I have this sort of niche. I take care of homeless people, all kinds of insurance, but I also take care of the political elite. So the Clintons, the Rumsfeld, the Cheneys, et cetera, Congress people. So I was in a very unique position, and I thought it would be important to leverage that position to say, hey, look, especially politicians, you come to DC, some of you talk smack about DC, and yet you don't know DC. And just to remind the audience, people look at other countries where there isn't representation and so forth, but DC does not have representation. We're not a state. And so when we talk about systems, systemic racism, institutionalized racism, this is baked into the very fabric of this country, right? And so going back to why I felt that I needed to do something is because I had a unique vantage point. The second reason is, as a medical educator, I was the program director for a residency program for 15 years, 108 residents. I was clerkship director for medical students prior to that. I saw a horrible trend happening. I saw medical students that went into medicine for all the right reasons. And by the time that they were finished, many of them objectified the very people on whose backs they trained. And I reflected on that a lot. And this is what I came up with, that we as academic institutions and places of higher learning, hospitals, the healthcare system in general, we actually teach racism and classism. So let me give you a specific example of how that is. So if two women come into the hospital, both with pneumonia. One is a college professor who teaches at GW. The other one is a homeless woman who's HIV positive, who has schizophrenia and is in the middle of a psychotic break. Who's easier to take care of? Well, of course, the college professor. You tell her, look, you've got to take this medicine when you go home with food. The antibiotic has to be refrigerated. You have to make an appointment. And if she can't get through the crazy GW call system, guess what? She calls one of her friends who knows somebody at the medical center. Hey, can you bring me in sooner for follow-up? Or she's having a problem, she calls and navigates and maybe even comes back to the emergency department and gets ushered in. The woman who is homeless, and let's say she's African American, is unable to speak the same language. First of all, she's psychotic. And so the communication which Ms. Ysabel spoke about and is so crucial is just missing, right? It's just, there is a disconnect. She may be yelling, she may even be spitting, right? And physicians are human beings too. And so if you see that kind of behavior, people tend to avoid. There's a lot of avoidance behavior when somebody is behaving in that manner. And then what happens is that this woman does not have the resources. She's homeless. And let me tell you something. One of the reasons that homeless people do not like to go to homeless shelters is because they get raped. It's 87 or 85% of homeless people are mentally ill. It's a very dangerous place. And so there is only one shelter in all of Washington, D.C. that has the capacity to take care of homeless people that have medical problems. So if it's 30 degrees outside and the administration is getting on the back of, let's say, the intern who's the lowest on the totem pole and the medical student, you got to get this person out. You got to get this person out. Guess what we do? We force that student or intern or young, learner to make unethical decisions, to go against their own ethics. They know that it's wrong to send somebody on the street when it's below freezing. And yet that is what the system is requiring. This capitalist system on steroids. They know that this woman needs more resources. They're the ones that have to fill out the paperwork because they're gonna have to, if she doesn't have Medicaid, they're gonna have to work with a case manager and so forth. There's a lot more of a administrative burden that is required to care for this because of the lack of resources, because this woman in the first place didn't have a home, is not eating food, good food, because the number one social determinant of mental health is food over shelter. Shelter's a close one, but if you ever see a homeless person, you want to help them, feed them. So what happens then is that during this process of training, when a learner sees a woman that fits that demographic, it's an internal eye roll. It's like, oh no, here we go again. I'm gonna have a lot more work that I have to do. It's not gonna be as satisfying to me and my ego, which is not a bad thing in and of itself. We're all human beings, but it won't be as satisfying. Physicians, depending on what specialty, need the feeding of egos. And so we are actually teaching racism and classism. And, what I always say in fora, like the one that we're on, is that it's not just the historical legacy. It's not just Tuskegee. It's not that we, the United States or the United States government, was the first government to use biological warfare when they had contaminated blankets with smallpox to deliberately infect and wipe out the indigenous peoples that inhabited this land, right? It is not just the Tuskegee study, which has had women. The father of OBGYN actually would, because he believed that Black women didn't feel pain like their white counterparts, would perform surgeries without anesthesia. But here's an example of the ongoing racism. So I went to University of Michigan for both undergrad and medical school. During COVID, one of the medical school graduates, 2003, from Michigan, Dr. Susan Moore, had COVID. She was hospitalized at Indiana University, and she was in pain. She couldn't breathe. Nobody would listen to her. Nobody. Because guess what? Just because you're educated, in her case as a Black woman, didn't make a difference. She used her camera to actually record that she was saying, I can't breathe, I'm in pain. She died. And what the medical apartheid system is, and that's what I call it because we've got to call it and name it for what it truly is, has shown is that Black women's maternal and infant mortality is worse if they are an educated, because we're always talking about education, which is very important. If she has a PhD, her outcomes are worse than an uneducated high school dropout, white high school dropout. So the points that I want to make, because I know we want to have a discussion, is, and I just want to say to Ms. Head, I had the great honor of attending at Howard University the presentation of the Legacy Project with 6 of the descendants from Tuskegee. The Rodham Institute is part of the Black Coalition Against COVID. We're actually on the steering committee and I'm a board member. And so it's important that these stories get out, but I want to say this and that. That's the history and this. So let's just take COVID as an example. If you remember at the very beginning of the COVID outbreak, you had the former administration say, well, the people that are affected, if you're over 70, you've had a good life. They're older. Why should we worry about them? And the people that die, they have pre-existing conditions, as though having high blood pressure or diabetes is a lifestyle choice, because that's what they want to make it. But the third group that they never mentioned, but it was implied, was a third of the deaths were happening in Black and Brown communities. Mm-hmm. So I call this passive genocide. I call that passive genocide. And if you look to your point, Ms. Ysabel, about the disinformation and misinformation that's out there, a lot of that actually targets people of color. I saw a 50-minute video, which is produced by right-wing, sort of Fox, and even to the right of them. It was animated, and they had a lot of Black and Brown characters in them. So who is to benefit? When we're talking about the healthcare system, we have to understand, first of all, to your point, it is neither health nor care, because it's really an illness model, right? And it's a reaction to illness. It's not about prevention. So not only would I say that I want to prevent or catch illnesses at a very early stage, but I also want to remind the listeners, 80% of all health outcomes have nothing to do with coming to see me as a doctor.
That's right.
They have to do with the structural and social determinants of health. So I talked to you about the big gap in health outcome in Washington, D.C. In Ward 8, only 42% of kids graduate from high school. If all I did as a doctor was to get those kids to graduate, I would add 10 years of life. Okay. So when we're talking about shifting the paradigm, we are really talking, it's important to have a socio-political economic lens, because when we look in Anacostia, and when we look at Berry Farm, that is a community that was deliberately dismantled. And I'll give you a little history lesson that I learned, and then I'll close, that Berry Farm used to be the Berry Farm tobacco plantation. And after the Emancipation Proclamation, the freedmen were given 400 acres that they transformed into a vibrant farming community. They were so successful that they actually built Howard University. 1 in 4 of the residents attended Howard University. Now 1 in 4 are in the prison school to prison pipeline system. So when you look at that and you look at the legacy project, what is it that makes a difference in people's health? Economic development, clinicians and people who are in the healthcare field that are of color, because studies show if you're a Black man and you have a Black physician, your health improves by 70%. It is calling out the racist systems, and one of the things that gets on my nerves is white coats for Black lives matter, the slogans, because DEI is the latest and the greatest.
Yeah.
And yet how the staff get treated and how they don't get the same protections as the people with letters behind their names is racist and classist. So finally, I want to just say that what we do at the Rodham Institute is we are not looking to save anybody. We've got 150 partners. Our goal is to improve health equity in Washington, D.C. The locus of control is with the community. They decide what their health priorities are. So the first thing that we did was we actually did an environmental scan, and guess what? Mental health was the #1 health priority of residents of Ward 7 and 8. They're the one that say, look, we want to have a mental health clinic on site in our church. And we say, okay, we will bring together the consultants. We serve at your pleasure. So just like the community needs to be, it's not only that there needs to be respect. No, we have to right size that abuse by making sure that it tips towards the community, because 400 years is a lot of time to make up, especially if we're still accruing debt.
Yeah.
And that coalitions and us working together, I'm of a generation of being involved not only in issues domestically, but in liberation movements internationally. And we used to say, one struggle, many fronts.
Yes, I grew up hearing that.
So whether it's South African apartheid or medical apartheid or whatever injustice there is, and if you recall, the late Dr. Martin Luther King, I mean, where he became challenging and a threat to the system, 2 things. He started talking about the Vietnam War, and he started working with Malcolm X because of power in numbers. Yes. So I question the very, sort of the paradigm. Mm-hmm. I have a colleague who has a group called Flip the Script.
Yes, I love it.
So I think I'll stop there, because obviously.
Yeah, before I pull the group together, I did really want to give you a few minutes to talk about, because you talked about how the medical community needs to apply the socioeconomic lens to it. And I really wanted to give you a few moments, and if you all will bear with us before we shift to the group to close out, to talk about, you have an applied health equity education model at the Rodham Institute. And I really want you to center for a couple of minutes on that, because to me, that captivates, again, the intentional education that needs to happen to create this lens for those that will be providing care. Talk about, can you for a few minutes, just what that means so people understand practically what's involved in that.
So the way that in general, the learners, be they medical students, nursing students, anybody that works in a clinic or hospital system that is not from communities, let's say in Southeast, I'll just make it easy, or from communities where there are undocumented or immigrant communities, they never interact with the communities except when people are coming in crisis. I don't know about you, but when I'm sick, my hair isn't done, I don't have my makeup, I don't have a chance to look good. I'm at my worst when I'm sick. So the first thing is to not just say, I'm going to research disparities. We're going to do something about them. That was the intent of the Rodham Institute. So what does that look like? What does that look like to shift from, just talking about the problem to really being part of the solution? Well, the first thing is we created an academic council, an academic community academic council, where you have community members, as well as community-based organizations, as well as academics, where they're the ones that are saying, okay, for this year, we want these issues to be covered. We want mental health and we want food insecurity to be covered. So what we do is we bring a panel. Let me give you a specific example, because this one I thought was just probably one of our best panels. We did a panel about sickle cell. So we brought the head of the NIH that does sickle cell work. We brought the advocate, the president of the Advocacy, National Advocacy Group. And then we brought the two people who had sickle cell. And this was all learners, it was a panel. And so they each talked about, their thing. And the one panelist who had sickle cell, he's 60 years old, he rarely comes to the hospital, he's living with sickle cell, talked to the group. Now, we had given 2 abstracts ahead of time. One abstract showed that 86% of people who are in the middle of a sickle cell painful crisis do not come to the emergency department because of how poorly we treat them. The second abstract shows that how we treat people in sickle cell crisis actually increases their pain. So the gentleman who had sickle cell leaned forward and said, when I see you in the emergency department, you treat me like crap. Wow. I'm writhing in pain and you treat me like a drug addict. Oh last I knew, there are none of you who are a pain medicine specialists in the emergency department. So that's really bringing together into the curriculum and helping, young people remember why it is that they went into and chose what I think is a noble profession, keeping their eyes on the prize, not going into communities to do a free clinic because you're replicating the same thing, just closer to home, but rather seeing people as equal, as having their own families, as leaders, as smart, as all of that. So that's what applied health equity looks like.
I love it. That's so, okay, I would put in the chat, I was like, yes, now she's saying, that is it. It's like, if I can create a banner for what she just said, and wear a t-shirt and a hat and a billboard, it is that. We come up with these solutions, but we just replicate the system in different places. But truly, you have transformed what I learned and studied at your curriculum. So thank you thank you all for staying with us. I know people was like, wait a minute, what happened? So what you said she was going to talk about, so she hit it. I love it. Thank you all.
And then I would just say this. I mean, I know that I spent some time laying out the framework.
But it's full. You need the fullness.
And I understand the comment that the person made on the chat. I appreciate that. But I think that these are interrelated. So perhaps we should have an ongoing conversation and we can be invited back, right? Because then we can, now we've set the stage, right? Now we can really have a robust conversation.
That is one of the things I told someone too. I said, consider this. I said, we can really only touch on the basics. I said, but definitely, with anything, we always say, we wish we had more time. So again, that's why I'm just so appreciative for everyone who stayed with us. But thank you for offering, because I generally say, can we have a next conversation? I would love to continue this. I'm going to bring Ysabel and Lillie in as well as we just try to close out. But it has been absolutely wonderful. Again, there's so much in this space, but it was important to inject what you just heard from these three women, because we hear so much of the hurt and the trauma and the misinformation, like it's a deluge. And I think if you just got an ounce of what was shared today, how much have you already transformed in how you're approaching healthcare? I know I am. So I would absolutely, I tell this to all the panels and symposiums that I do, that I'm wonderfully happy that we've connected here at the center in this work, and it doesn't stop here. So this is truly beginning of a relationship, as long as I'm the health equity program manager at the center. So I'm so thankful to be connected to you. I do want to give each of you, before I close out, just a minute to just give as we sort of want to wrap up what today means and what you hope people will take away from this conversation as a collective. And Lillie, I'll start with you, and I'll go in the order that you spoke.
Thank you so much, Dora. And I'd like to thank Ms. Ysabel and Dr. El-Bayoumi. I think
you can just call me Gigi. Gigi's fine.
Gigi. I appreciate you all. And what I would like to reiterate what Ysabel said about understanding the consent form and reading it all and asking questions and not be afraid of questions. And this is something that we are trying to do with the foundation, is understanding that consent form and being empowered ourselves to learn more about what is being done, how it's being done, and how it's going to impact not only me, but also my family. So that's that, and the community. That's important. Yes. And from Gigi, I would like to say that you at the end you really nailed it about the example that you gave on treating a person like crap. And this is important, because I think it starts with respecting each individual as a human being and giving them the respect that they deserve, no matter who they are and where they come from. And in talking with medical students this year, collaborating with some of the medical students, that was one of the things that descendants tried to hone in on, is that you're treating a human being and an individual, and you can't lose sight of that no matter what your obstacles and what challenges you have when you meet with them. So I commend the Virginia Interfaith Center and Dora for bringing this together. And I would just like to say, when I say together, and that means all of us, we can work together to change the paradigm, the system, and everything. But we have to work together, and we have to include the community, the human beings in that community. We just can't do it from the scientific point, but we have to include the humans.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much.
Thank you, Lillie. Ysabel?
I think that Lillie was singing my song there about including community. I'm hoping to leave what I think is a glorious story of the community helping itself when it could get no one else to hear its voice. So in the San Francisco Mission District, which became a petri dish for COVID, 32 Latino service agencies, because the Mission District is heavily Latino, got together to fight COVID and to bring services to the community when they couldn't get the city hall and they couldn't get public health to hear their cries. And so they coalesced together. They put all of their resources to work together. They created a food hub, which now serves 9,000 boxes of food a week. They got UCSF to set up a testing mechanism because they wanted to prove they had high incidence of COVID and infection. And in the testing, they had about 45% of the Latino community participated in that testing. And they found out that 90% of them had infection and the majority of them worked on the outside. So then they'd come back to these multi-housing units and of course spread the infection. And oftentimes they aguantar, they put up because they needed to go work. But the community coalesced to work with all of these issues, and they got pop-up clinics on the streets where the big transportation hubs were. So they were getting people tested and they were registering them with volunteers and doing it in Spanish as well as English. And then when they finally proved their case, City Hall gave them $28 million. To take care of all of the services because there was a lot of issues. And the final thing was that they got 2 pop-up sites for vaccination. And between March and May of this past year, they got 25,000 people vaccinated.
Wow.
The Latino community in San Francisco is 15% of a population of about 866,000 people in the city and county of San Francisco. Currently, 83% of the Latino population is vaccinated.
Powerful.
And that was not done by City Hall. That was done by the coalition and by the healthcare teams and by the people who ignited themselves. Community can win, it can push, it can be its own answer. We just have to ignite it and provide invest in and provide those resources and have some great leaders like they had. And I always love this story when I hear this because, this was embracing people, not herds. This was embracing
the concept you talked about. We didn't talk about it earlier, but you had mentioned when we were prepping the concept of the building familia in healthcare. Yeah,
exactly. Well, who doesn't feel best with familia? Who doesn't become the people who prod you? Who doesn't care the most about you? We just, in the Latino community, have an expanded idea of what familia is. It's not just your brother and sister and mother and father, or etc. It is your compadre, and then it's the neighborhood woman down the street there, and then your social group and your church and so on. And that becomes that familia. And everybody's soul is worth saving. So there is a great deal.
I love that.
There is a great deal of beauty and spirituality in the idea of familia. And so it is something that even you could be generations away from having, either come from a Latin American country or being born in this country, which if you've seen the latest population of Latinos, which is now 62 million people, 8 out of 10 of them are in fact US citizens. So some of them are native born, which is the greater percentage, and some of them are legalized. So the point is that you've got a huge community with these multiplicity of historical cultures, but who speak a language and share a concept of familia that really embraces everybody. And I just wanted to describe for you who may not know the differences amongst the Latino subpopulations, which are 22. Some of us eat salsa and some of us dance salsa.
That's so cute. I love that.
Multitask.
There you go. I love it. Thank you. And so there's so much. Oh my God, I wish we had so much time. I grew up in a Latino neighborhood in the Bronx, and so I grew up with that concept, and it drives so much. Again, it wasn't just sort of me and mine, and that's it. It really was the beyond your block. It was that community, and it makes you organize and do what you just said, that example. So thank you for that. Definitely look forward to having more conversations with you. I hope you do too. Gigi, and now you.
Yes.
I love you all. Okay, Gigi.
Thank you. Family, I think, is a central concept for all cultures. I mean, the thing actually, I'm at GW, but Georgetown, which is actually beginning to talk about its slave past as a means of truth and reconciliation. They actually would sell off a slave girl to when they were running low on money. But this is what I want to leave people with. When we work together, we can make a difference. On April 3rd, we were invited by Cora Masters-Berry, the former First Lady of DC, to have a vaccination event, a mass vaccine event in Ward 8, for Ward 8. The Rodham Institute brought Howard, GW, Georgetown, Children's. We vaccinated 900 people on that one day.
Wow.
And we did that by, how did we do that? Did we just walk in and say, here, we're here to save the day? No, we had 9 educational sessions, 90-minute sessions with the community leaders and organizations that serve the people of Ward 8. So that they were the ones that, because they know who's a shut-in, they know who doesn't have a computer, they know who doesn't read, they know the community. So it wasn't us that was signing people up, they were the ones. So the model that we want to use is from interdependence to independence. The dream is that communities are restored, have their own self-determination, are treated with respect and dignity. And because we all deserve that as human beings. And I just want to say the final thought is that oftentimes on the medical side, you know, people think that there is nothing happening in communities. And I always correct them, because one of the largest churches in Washington, DC, that we're a partner with as Temple of Praise, they have a total of 60,000 congregants, you know, in terms of their cluster. They have served since the beginning of COVID 1.5 million meals.
Wow.
Not just to congregants, but for the people in the neighborhood. They have a 3-time-a-week vaccine and testing center. Bishop Staples is building a senior housing unit. They have now allowed people to take courses on site from the University of the District of Columbia. We are working with them we have actually a dermatology clinic on site that's for people, you know, for skin of color, because everybody thinks that it's the same thing, when actually I learned something new. Eczema causes as much disability as diabetes does. So, and then we are doing a curriculum on colon cancer education, where guess what? The congregants and the leadership are sitting down with the medical folks to talk about what are the barriers to getting a colonoscopy? What is the language that should be used? They're teaching us.
That's
because
it.
The locus of control is the community. The people who are closest to the problem have the solutions. They may not have the resources, but they know best.
That's it. Beautiful, 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 beautiful. Thank you all again so very much. Gigi, you're amazing, brilliant. I'm so inspired. And again, I look forward to continuing to work and do this. The JAB initiative was ongoing until next summer. And so we definitely will have more opportunities. I want to develop resources out of our conversations that we can share with our congregations and base. I usually close out all my panels and discussions with to stay informed, stay inspired, and stay connected. And my closing thought for today is a quote from Mahatma Gandhi: "Truth never damages a cause that is just." Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.